Shown here is a 2x2 matrix that can be depicting a prisoner's dilemma. What we have is one player that can either cooperate or defect, and another player that can either cooperate or defect. And when you have two players interacting, the interactions can either be cooperation-cooperation, defection-cooperation, defection-defection, or the converse of defection-cooperation, which would be cooperation-defection. And we can look at the payoffs associated with the player over here. When the player cooperates, the other player can either cooperate or the other player can defect. And we call when both players cooperate mutual cooperation. When one player cooperates and the other player defects, we call that unilateral cooperation. Alternatively, looking at the player over here, that individual can defect, and the other player can either cooperate or defect. If the other player cooperates, then we call this player's behavior unilateral defection, and if the other player defects, we call this player's behavior part of a mutual defection. We can assign payoff values to these various combinations. The payoff value associated with defection by the player that whose payoff we're considering, where the other player cooperates, we call that T, which stands for temptation to defect. When the first player, the one that we're focusing on, cooperates and the other player cooperates as well, we call the payoff value R for reward for mutual cooperation. When the first player cooperates and the second player defects, so the focus player cooperates, this again is unilateral cooperation, and this is described as the sucker's payoff. When you cooperate and the other individual defects, you're the sucker. And then alternatively, when both players defect, you have a payoff that's called P, and this is the punishment for mutual defection. The situation where T, the payoff value T, is greater than the payoff value R, which in turn is greater than the payoff value P, which in turn is greater than the payoff value S, that we call a prisoner's dilemma. In a prisoner's dilemma, it doesn't matter what the individual, that is the other player, does. It always pays off to defect, and that's because when the other player cooperates, T is greater than R. Defection is a better strategy than cooperation in terms of short-term payoff values. And when the other player defects, again, it's preferable to defect because P is greater than S. Again, the better short-term strategy is to defect, whether the other player defects or the other player cooperates.